האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov and good evening, everyone. We are in Dobro V'Yetcher also. We are in the Zera Shimshon on Parsha Be'halot'cha, section 3, Os Gimel. And before we begin, we're going to take a look at 10 psukim from the Parsha. That's more psukim than I think we've ever looked at before we did a piece in the Zera Shimshon. But you'll see that the Zera Shimshon is going to make comments that relate to all of these different psukim. It will become important, not necessarily from the beginning, but as we go on, it will become important to have a familiarity with these psukim. So this is Sefer Bamidbar Perek Yud, starting with Pasuk Lamed Gimel, continuing to Perek Yud Aleph, a Pasuk Vav. And the very famous inverted nuns are in these psukim. If you don't know what I mean, we'll talk about that as we go. Okay. Vayisu mehar Hashem derech shloshes yomim. So the Torah narrative returns to when Bnei Yisrael left Har Sinai, and it says, and they traveled from the mountain of Hashem on a 3-day journey. Va'aron bris Hashem nosea lifnehem, and the Aron, the box that either held the luchos, or some feel this was a different Aron that held the shivrei luchos, the broken parts, the shards of the first luchos. Either way, one of the aronot, one of the boxes that had very sacred items inside of it, of the covenant of Hashem, traveled in front of them. Derech shloshes yamim, a 3-day trip in front of them. Lasur lahem menucha, to search out for them a resting place. Va'anan Hashem alehem yomam, and the cloud of Hashem was over them during the day, bin nosam min hamachaneh, when they traveled from the camp. Now, in the Torah at this point, there is a large space, and in that space is an upside-down letter Nun. If you haven't seen it before, take a look in any Chumash, any Chumash that you have, and you'll see it. It's quite remarkable. After the upside-down nun in the space, the Torah says, Vayehi ben soa ha'aron, and it was when the Aron traveled, Vayomer Moshe, and Moshe said, Kuma Hashem, arise Hashem, v'yafutzu oivecha, and scatter your enemies, v'yanusu misanecha miponecha, and may those who hate you flee from before you. Uvenucho yomar, and when the Aron rested, stopped moving ahead of them. In other words, Moshe would say, Shuva Hashem, dwell Hashem, rivavos alfei Yisrael, among the myriads of thousands of Yisrael. Then there appears another large space with an inverted nun inside of that space, almost like a bracket. So those two psukim are separated from the rest of the text by these spaces and inverted nuns inside in the middle of each space. Next pasuk, Vayehi ha'om kimisonanim, and it was that the people were like complainers, Ra be'oznei Hashem, and saying bad things in the ears of Hashem. Vayishma Hashem, and Hashem heard. Vayichar apo, and his anger was kindled. Vativar bam eish Hashem, and a fire of Hashem burnt among the people. Vatochal biktsei hamachaneh, and it consumed at the edge of the camp. Exactly who the fire consumed is a matter of discussion, but the fire came and started consuming people. Vayitzak ha'am el Moshe, and the people cried out to Moshe. Vayispal Moshe el Hashem, and Moshe davened to Hashem. Vatishka ha'esh, and the fire settled down. The fire went down; it subsided. Vayikra Shem hamakom hahu Taveira, and he called the name of that place Taveira, ki vo'aravam eish Hashem, because a fire of Hashem burned among the people. The word Taveira means a burning, a place where a burning took place. V'hasafsuf asher bikirbo, and the rabble that was among them, that of course is a reference to the Erev Rav, the non-Jews, the Egyptians and other non-Jews who joined the people when they left Mitzrayim and tended to cause problems. So the rabble that was among the Jewish people, his avu ta'ava, they had a craving, v'yoshuvu vayivku gam b'nei Yisrael, and b'nei Yisrael also went back and started crying. Vayomru, and they said, Mi ya'achilenu basar, who will feed us meat? So the Erev Rav started talking about wanting meat and having cravings for things, and then Bnei Yisrael took up the chant, the complaints, and said, "Who will give us meat?" Zacharnu es hadoga asher nochal b'Mitzrayim chinam. We're remembering the fish that we ate in Mitzrayim for free. Eis hakishuim, the cucumbers, ve'eis ha'avatichim, and the melons, ve'es ha'chotzir, and the leeks, ve'es ha'bitzolim, and the onions, ve'es ha'shumim, and the garlic. Ve'ata, and now nafshenu yevesha, our souls are dried out. Ain cold, there's nothing to eat that we want. Bilti el haman einenu, except for the mun, which we see in front of our eyes. There are different ways of explaining what that means, but those are the 10 psukim. So just to quickly recap those psukim, basically they start off with, the Torah starts off by telling us the Bnei Yisrael left Har Sinai, and they were on a 3-day journey, and the Aaron traveled in front of them. And then we have the 2 offset psukim with the upside down nuns bracketing them that talk about what Moshe would say when the Aaron lifted up to go travel, and what Moshe would say when the Aaron settled back to earth and found and rested and stayed there and stopped moving. And then the Torah tells us about seemingly 2 episodes of complaining. The first, misonanim, there are complaints, and a fire comes and burns up some people. And that place is called Tavera. And then after that, it talks about the Erev Rav wanting cravings for meat and food, and Bnei Yisrael picking up the chant, and them complaining about the mun and not being satisfied with the mun, and having all these nostalgic memories about the wonderful foods that they ate back in Mitzrayim. So it's quite a set of psukim. Now let's see what the Zera Shimshon is going to do. By the way, this piece is a bit too long for us to do in one session, so we're going to do the first half of the piece, and at the end of the first half, before we stop, I'll just give a little bit of information about what's coming up, what comes up in the second half of this piece. But we'll have our hands full with the first section, with the first piece. Os Gimel in the Zera Shimshon. Yesh loses ta'am. There is a need to give a reason. Lama la'oso hador dafka. Why is it? Was that it was only to this specific generation? Osar HaKadosh Baruch Hu bisar ta'ava. That Hashem prohibited meat to be eaten out of desire. Shemashelo osar l'doros habayim, which is not something that Hashem prohibited for future generations. So, of course, we need to pause and understand, what is basar tava, what is basar, what is meat of desire? And the answer is that meat that is brought for korbanos, for sacrifices, is meat that Bnei Yisrael had a mitzvah to be involved with. Sometimes korbanos were simply brought to the Mishkan at that time, and were handled appropriately there by the Kohanim. Sometimes there were korbanos that all or part of the meat could be eaten, and so the meat of the korbanos, of course, when it was supposed to be eaten, was part of the mitzvah of the korbanos, part of the sacred avoda, the sacred worship services, and the people ate the meat. Kohanim ate the meat sometimes, regular people ate the meat sometimes, and that was fine. That's basar kodshim, meat from holy sacrifices. If a person just wanted to eat meat without any korban being involved, they had no obligation to bring a sacrifice, they weren't bringing a sacrifice, and they just wanted to eat meat, that's called bisar ta'ava. That's what the Zera Shimshon's talking about here. That's meat that a person wanted to eat just out of desire. They wanted to eat meat. We're very familiar with that. The people who are not vegetarians, they know what it means to just crave meat, want meat, desire to have a salami sandwich or a nice steak, whatever it might be. and we want meat. So that's called basar tava. So the Zera Shimshon here is asking a question: why is it that for the generation that traveled through the Midbar, Hashem forbade eating of meat, unless it was for a korban, unless it was for a sacrifice, and then the people who were supposed to eat the sacrifice could eat meat. But other than that, if the people in the Midbar during the 40-year journey wanted to eat meat, that for no connection to a korban reason, for a reason that's not connected to a sacrifice, they couldn't do so. So the Zera Shimshon ask, what's the reason for that? And he's going to give us two approaches to answer, to explain why Hashem forbade eating meat that wasn't connected to the bringing of a sacrifice in the Midbar. Now, we should point out as an aside that this whole idea that basar tava, meat that's not connected to a sacrifice, was forbidden to eat to the Jews in the Midbar is only according to one opinion in the Gemara. It's a machlokas in the Gemara. And one opinion has it that, in fact, it was prohibited, as the Zera Shimshon is saying here. And the other opinion is that it was permissible, that there was no prohibition on basar tava, on just eating meat out of a desire to eat meat in the Midbar. But let's go with the school of thought, as the Zera Shimshon is clearly going, that it was forbidden for them. And the Zera Shimshon is asking why. Why was it forbidden for them to do so? Next paragraph on the left. After the Jewish people merited to see Hashem face to face, as it were, so to speak, al Har Sinai, on Mount Sinai, vilishmoa kolo, and to hear his voice, eno min haroi, it would not be appropriate. We're now continuing to the next page, column on the right. Sheyishlot bohem rima visoleya, that they should that worms and insects should have any power over their bodies. We'll explain as we do the next few lines what that's talking about. Kemosha amru zichronim levracha, as Chazal say, shelo sholta bohem rima visoleya. Chazal say that for the Jews of the Midbar, in the Midbar, the worms and insects that would normally begin to consume a corpse, a dead body, they did not have any power. When the Jews in the Midbar died, they were immune from, they were protected from worms and other insects that would normally begin to consume the bodies of of people who had died. And therefore, because the Jews in the Midbar had experienced Har Sinai and an incredible experience and closeness to Hashem, Hashem did not want them to eat meat for basar taiva purposes, just out of desire, because that would lead to their bodies being susceptible after death to the worms and the bugs. Disnan, as it states in a Mishnah in Avos, marbe basar, marbe rimo. A person who consumes more meat has more worms after death to consume the person's body. So therefore, if eating meat brings about the consumption of the body after death by worms, Hashem did not feel it was appropriate for the Jewish people to experience that, and therefore he forbade the eating of meat for non-sacrificial purposes. V'rak hitir lohem achilas b'sar hakodshim, and he only allowed the people in the Midbar to eat meat when it was for kadoshim, when it was sacred meat, when it was involved with the bringing of korbanos. Shehu davar kadosh, because the meat from korbanos related to any of the different types of sacrificial services, that meat is sacred. Ve'eno yotze lechulin, and it doesn't go out to be treated like non-sacrificial meat, meaning it has a whole different status and a whole different set of rules apply to Basar HaKadoshim, to holy sacred meat, sacrificial meat, meat from korbanos, than from regular meat that a person might just eat because he or she wanted to. And the holy meat does not lead to the worms and insects consuming a person's body if that's the only meat they eat after a person dies. Uchemoshe kosfu hamukubolim, as the Kabbalistic masters wrote, shekol ma she'odem ochel, everything that a person eats, b'seudas mitzvah, at a seudas mitzvah, a meal that is being consumed for a mitzvah purpose, uvayom tov, and on holidays, eno naser rima, the masters of Kabbalah and Mekubalim said that part of their body that comes from the food that they ate at a seudas mitzvah or on a yom tov doesn't get turned into worms after a person dies. And therefore, this whole prohibition doesn't apply. It's not relevant to future generations who did not experience Har Sinai, did not have the intimate encounter with Hashem at Har Sinai, did not hear Hashem's voice at Har Sinai. So that's reason number one. Let's pause to make sure we understand what Zera Shimshon just taught us. Zera Shimshon's opening question was, why were the Jewish people, the door of the Midbar and the wilderness for 40 years, why were they prohibited from eating meat unless it was part of a korban connected to a sacrifice? Why was that prohibition existed? So Zera Shimshon just gave us his first reason. Answer, those people had experienced Har Sinai, and Hashem felt like it wouldn't be appropriate for their holy bodies, the bodies who had experienced such a high spiritual level and such a high, lofty spiritual experience, wouldn't be appropriate for their bodies to be consumed by worms after they died. And so he didn't want them to eat meat, which would lead them, meat that wasn't connected to a korban, which would lead their bodies to be susceptible to worms and insects after death. There's reason number one. And that's why after the Jewish people came into Eretz Yisrael, the prohibition was taken away. The children in the future generations, until today, there is no prohibition of eating meat, basar tava, meat, just because we'd like to eat meat, even though there's obviously no korbanos today. Next paragraph. V'od mitam acher, and there is another reason. Nami osir lohem basar tava, and also another reason why Hashem forbade to the Dor HaMidbar, the Jews in the wilderness, to eat meat for non-sacrificial purposes. Shelefi shenidbeku b'Hashem b'mamad Har Sinai, since they clung to Hashem, had this special, as we said above, encounter and closeness to Hashem on Har Sinai, as the pasuk says, "Va'atem hadvekim b'Hashem," you who cling to Hashem. Osir lahem habasar, Hashem forbade for them meat, kedei shelo yismashchu achar hayetzer hara, because in order to prevent them from being pulled after the yetzer hara, after the evil inclination. She'ein ari nohem, because a lion doesn't roar, ela mitoch kupa shel basar, unless it is in the middle of eating or consuming or being next to a box of meat. So that's a quote, as you can see from the Gemara in Brachos, and the Zera Shimshon is using that quote as it's understood by Chazal to mean that a person doesn't sin, a person doesn't become arrogant and haughty and turn away from Hashem and commit averos unless they are, so to speak, celebrating, unless they've been eating too much meat and they're kind of partying over how much meat they have and how much the food they have to eat, and then that leads them astray. That leads them to go astray. Just as the lion roars, a nice, quiet, peaceful lion, put a bunch of meat in front of him, and he's going to roar out of desire and passion and assert himself because now he's got all this meat. Well, so too with people, Hashem decided, I don't want the Jews in the Midbar to have access to meat except through korbanos, because if they eat meat, it can lead them to sin. It can lead them to follow after their yetzer hara and to transgress. Whereas if they don't eat meat, unless it's for korbanos, then there will be less of a desire to follow their evil inclinations and less of a desire and less of a likelihood that they will commit transgressions. So those are the two reasons why the Zera Shimshon explains why Hashem forbade bisar tava, eating of meat, not connected to bringing of a korban in the midbar for the Jews in the wilderness. Next paragraph. V'zehu de amrinan b'medrash Yalkut. And this is what we say this is connected to what we say in the Yalkut Shimoni Medrash. al pasuk, on the pasuk from our parsha. It's one of the psukim that we read before we began. Mi ya'achilenu basar. Who will give us meat? So that those words, that phrase came from where it said that the Asafsuf, the rabble, the Erev Rav, started spreading all these, enticing everyone with memories of meat and other foods that they ate in Mitzrayim, and spreading the idea that that everyone should be craving and missing those foods. And the Jewish people took up the refrain and said, Mi yachilenu basar, who's going to give us meat? We want meat too. It's not just the Erev Rav, we want meat. So the Medrash asks, was it really simply because they had no meat that they started complaining? Is that really what was going on? No, rather the people were looking for a pretext, lifrosh me'acharei hamakom, to turn away and separate themselves from Hashem. That's what the Yalkut Shimoni says. The meat was only an excuse. They were looking for a reason. After Bnei Yisrael left Har Sinai, the Erev Rav for sure, and it even led to the people, were looking to say, that was too lofty. That was too spiritual. We need to get away from there and to get back to, quote unquote, a normal way of life. And so they were looking for a complaint that they could use to justify their desire to move away from following after Hashem. And what did they come upon? They came upon meat. We don't have meat. We miss the meat. We don't have food that we enjoy eating, and that's a real problem for us. And that's Moshe. That's your fault, Hashem, so to speak. That's your fault, Chas v'sholem. And so they took up those complaints. Zera Shimshon says, "V'koshe." This is difficult to understand. Ma alila hayu mevakshim. What pretext exactly were they looking for? V'lama dafka bebasar, and why specifically did they choose meat hayu mevakshim alila in order to find some kind of pretext? Zera Shimshon isn't asking these as independent questions; they're rhetorical questions. This piece in the Yalkut Shimoni tells us that the craving for meat was just a cover story because they wanted to pull away from Hashem. They didn't want to be as holy and as spiritual and as lofty as they were, and as, so to speak, confined by following after Hashem meticulously. They didn't want that. And so they came up with this excuse about complaining about the lack of meat. And so the Zera Shimshon says, well, why was that? What we need to understand why. What's the connection between the meat and the wanting to pull away from Hashem? Next paragraph. Ela lefi she'hakodesh baruch hu lo hitir lehem b'sar tava, but it's because Hashem did not permit to them eating meat whenever they might want to. He didn't permit that. He forbade that, as we said above. In order that their evil inclinations wouldn't have more power over them, eating of meat and having excessive luxuries and meat to eat would lead them to follow after their Yetzer Haras. And Hashem didn't want that, so he told them, don't eat meat unless it's connected to a korban. V'heim adarabba, but they had just the opposite idea. They wanted and craved to eat meat. Why? Because they wanted their Yetzer Hara to have more control over them. As we also see, they wanted to eat cucumbers. It was mentioned in the little list of things that they were remembering and that they missed. One of the things was kishuin, was cucumbers, or we might other people translate it in a different way, but let's go with that. Shahakishuim heim molidim chomrius va'achirus, because eating cucumbers bring out a chomrius, a kind of materialisticness or a coarseness, va'achirus, and a murkiness, b'seichel shel b'nei adam, in the intelligence of a person. So they didn't just have a certain food that they wanted to eat for kind of innocent purposes. Oh yeah, it's nice to have pickles and meat and garlic and onions. It does sound nice, but there was more to it, the Zera Shimshon says. What there was the fact that the people knew that eating certain foods sometimes just eating them, sometimes eating them in excess, could lead them to have more evil desires, have more tavos, have more cravings for things that are not permissible, have their yetzer haras be more powerful. And they wanted that. That's what they were looking to get. Umishum hachi lo rotza HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because of this, Hashem did not want, top of the next column, sheyit amu ta'amam bamon. Hashem did not want them to be able to taste the taste of cucumbers in the mun, because that would be a taste that would be connected to the eating of cucumbers, which could lead to this coarseness and materialisticness. Man was considered a pure and clean bread, a pure and clean food. Hashem didn't want it to be tainted, so to speak, with even the taste of things which ran counter to the pureness and the special cleanliness of the purity of the mun. But they were looking for a pretext. And they wanted to separate themselves from following Hashem. Because they knew they knew that the prohibition of meat, meaning basar tava, meat for not for sacrificial purposes, that prohibition came to them because they had clung to Hashem, may he be blessed, b'mamad Har Sinai, when they stood at Har Sinai. So the Zera Shimshon is sharing with us a fascinating insight. When we read in the Torah that they complained about not having meat and they remembered all these yummy foods they ate in Mitzrayim, it wasn't just about the food. It was about they wanted to be able to eat things such as basar tava, such as meat, when it's not connected to a korban, just out of desire, that would lead them to be less spiritual, that would lead them to be move away from Hashem and a very meticulous adherence to his mitzvos and his words. They wanted to be free of that, so to speak. And they wanted their yetzer hara to have more power over them, to pull them away from closely following and being closely connected to Hashem. So that's kind of the secret underlying reason as to why they were complaining about not having meat and remembering these other foods, such as the cucumbers. Next paragraph. Ubishabes parak called kisve. Okay. Before we get into this, the next section, I just need to mention what the Gemara that's coming up right here that Zera Shimshon is going to quote. So we talked about the inverted nuns, the upside down nuns, and how they bracketed and kind of offset the two psukim about Moshe saying certain words when the Aaron lifted up and traveled ahead of the people, and certain special words when the Aaron rested again and stayed in the new place that it had found. So that the Gemara itself asked the question in Masechah Shabbos, we're about to see it, what are the two nuns doing there, like as brackets before and after these psukim? So the Gemara answers that they are there to separate between one calamitous event and a second calamitous event, meaning the Torah did not want to have any kind of narrative in which two bad events happen back to back. Rather, the Torah wanted to separate between them, and the Gemara says the bracketed section with the psukim between them are separating between a calamitous event that comes before them and a calamitous event that comes after them. And we read those psukim, and so now the Zera Shimshon is going to bring in the Gemara that will talk more specifically about what these calamitous events are. And as we'll see, Rashi makes a mystifying comment that's hard to understand, and the Zera Shimshon will show us how Rashi's explanation of this, a part of this Gemara, fits in beautifully and supports wonderfully the ideas that he's developed so far. Ubishabes parak called Kisvei, and Masechah Shabbos in the chapter called Kisvei, Amrinon, we say, for onus rishona maihi. What was the first calamitous event, the first calamity that appears in the Torah before the bracketed psukim? And the Gemara answers, Vayisu mehar Hashem. It's the very innocent, innocuous sounding words that they traveled away from the mountain of Hashem. That's how the psukim began, right? If you think back to the psukim, or you look back to the psukim, you'll see that the first pasuk that we read was they traveled away from Har Sinai. The Torah is picking up the narrative from when the Jew Bnei Yisrael left Har Sinai, and they went on a 3-day journey, and that's a calamity. How is that a calamity? V'omar Rabbi Chama b'Rebbi Chanina. Rabbi Chama, the son of Rabbi Chanina, comments and says you have to look at the words very carefully and on a more deep, in a deep way. Shesoru me'acharei Hashem. What does the Torah mean that they traveled from the mountain of Hashem? It's not just telling us what they did. It's telling us they turned aside from following after Hashem. When they left Har Sinai, some people already had in their minds, let's leave Har Sinai, not just to travel away from it, not just geographically leave Har Sinai, let's spiritually leave Har Sinai. Let's depart from following after Hashem. That's what Rami Chama Rebbi Chanina explains. Uperish Rashi. Rashi comments, B'soch shlosha yomim lemasa'am. Within 3 days of journeying away from Har Sinai, hisavu ha'asavsuf ta'ava, the rabble Erev Rav craved a craving, lehisra'am al habasar, to complain about meat, not having meat, kedei limrod bashem, in order to kind of incite a revolt against Hashem. So this is the bewildering comment by Rashi, and let's talk for a moment about why it's a very hard to understand comment. The words Vayistu mehar Hashem, they traveled away from the mountain of Hashem, do not appear within any proximity at all in terms of that pasuk or the next couple of psukim to the people, the Erev Rav, leading complaints about not having meat. As a matter of fact, if you either again remember the psukim that we read in the beginning or look at them again, refresh your memory of the psukim, you'll see that the leaving Har Hashem is the first pasuk in that set of 10 psukim, and only at the end of the 10 psukim does it talk about the Erev Rav, the rabble, and the Asapsuf bringing up the craving for meat. So why does Rashi say, what does it mean they left Har Sinai and were trying to depart from Hashem? And he connects that to the craving for meat, which happens much later in the psukim. It happens after the 2 nuns. Rashi's making it seem like the craving for meat is talked about before the 2 nuns because he says it's the first calamity, that the 2 nuns are separating from the second calamity. But it doesn't seem to be the first calamity because it happens after the 2 nuns. And we'll see right now that the Ramban asks that question on Rashi. Continuing in the text, Ramban b'feirusho, the Ramban in his commentary, Hiksha Olav, he asks a question on Rashi. Lefisha hapuronu shel ta'ava, the calamity of the desiring of meat, ksuva b'parsha, it's written in this section of the Torah, achar vayehi ha'am kemisonanim, after the pasuk about the people complained and the fire came and burned among them. And that pasuk came right after the 2 nuns. So the Ramban is saying to Rashi, you're telling us that when it says the people left and traveled away from Har Sinai, it's somehow referring to the craving for meat, and it somehow can be identified as the first calamity that took place before the section of the 2 nuns. But that's impossible, Ramban says, or at least, let's not say impossible. That's hard to understand, the Ramban asks, because the pasuk about the craving for meat actually happened after what's identified as the second calamity of the taveira, of the burning of the fire, because the people complained they were misonanim, ra ba'oznei Hashem. That's the second calamity. It happens after the 2 nuns. So how can the craving for meat somehow be flipped and appear to take place before the 2 nuns when it's actually after what appears to be the second calamity and seems to be part of the second calamity because it all has to do with complaining against Hashem? So the Ramban has a very strong question on Rashi. Rashi's very hard to understand, and now the Zera Shimshon will show us the light. Next paragraph. Besides for what the Mizrahi commentary, which is Re'im stands for Rabbeinu Eliyahu Mizrahi. It's one of the earliest and most famous commentaries on Rashi. So Rashi has a commentary in the Torah, and the Re'im is a commentary to help explain Rashi. Besides what he explains to answer this question, Lefi Darkenu Asi Shapir, according to our approach that we've used in this piece that we've developed so far, Rashi makes perfect sense. She'inyan soru me'acharei Hashem, because the idea of the people wanting to turn away from Hashem, ve'inyan she'elas habosar, and the idea that they were asking for meat and complaining about not having meat, hu hakol inyan echad, that's all the same thing. All of that goes together. Shehoyu rotzim lehisrachek mehakadusha, and it all, the common denominator is they wanted to distance themselves from holiness. Ulihisdabek b'yetzer hara uvatuma, and they wanted to begin to cling more closely to the yetzer hara, the evil inclination, uvatuma, and to impurity. Ve'enom shtei pur anuyos, and it's not two separate calamities, meaning the words that the Jewish people traveled away from Har Sinai, meaning with the insight of Chazal, meaning they wanted to depart from being close to Hashem, that idea, and the later pasuk about complaining about not having meat and wanting to eat meat, craving meat, those are not two separate topics. Kemosha Choshev Shom HaRamban Zichron Livracha, as the Ramban considers them. Elavo Yehi Ha'am Kimisonenim. But rather, when it says, and the people were like complainers, hu poranus echad, that is one calamity. V'hasheni hu vayisu mehar Sinai, and the second calamity was them traveling away from Har Sinai. The way we understand that means wanting to depart from Hashem. V'hu atzmo oso shel ha'asafsuf, and that idea of traveling away from Har Sinai, that is the same idea as the idea that comes in a later pasuk about the rabble, the Erev Rav, craving meat and convincing the rest of the people to complain about meat and to tell Moshe how much they wanted meat. Next paragraph. V'nicha shapir lashon haGemara, and now the language in the Gemara fits in perfectly. Lefi darko shel Rashi, according to the explanation of Rashi, Zichron Livracha. Because the Gemara actually asked, what was the second calamity? Before it asked about the first calamity, it asked, what was the second calamity? And only after that does it ask, what was the first calamity? V'havale l'meimar, one would have expected the Gemara to say techila first, poronus rishona mahi, to ask what was the first calamity. Umishum hachi hifsik ha'inyan, and because of this, meaning because of this new way that we can understand this Gemara, and we can understand the psukim, and we can understand what Rashi was trying to teach us, because of all this, now we can understand the true meaning of what the Gemara, what Chazal were teaching us when they said that the section of two psukim with the nuns around them, the inverted nuns, had to go in between these two other sets of psukim, lefi sherodzu lehisrachek minun shel hakedusha, continuing to the next page on the right, because it means it represented, it symbolized, the nun symbolized that the people wanted to distance themselves, minun shel hakedusha, from the first nun, which stood for a nun of holiness, ulehidabek benun shel hayetzer hara, and to cling to the second nun, which represented the nun of the yetzer hara, dahainu nochash hakadmoni, the nun that symbolizes the nochash, from the word nochash, snake, the primordial snake. That's what's symbolized by the second nun. And therefore these nuns are written as either upside down nuns or nuns which are written strangely in some other way. The nuns that bracket the two psukim in the middle of the 10 psukim that we looked at, are always written, again, either upside down, inverted, or in some other unusual way to show that they're not part of any word, they're not to be read, but they separate off the same way we would actually use brackets, they separate off the psukim that are there. So let's go back and make sure we understand how the Zera Shimshon is explaining the Gemara in Masechta Shabbos. What the Zera Shimshon is saying is that the Gemara understood that there was a pasuk before the two nuns that was directly connected to a pasuk after the two nuns, and it wants us to see those two psukim as going together, and therefore when it talks about the two calamities, it's talking about one calamity that involves a pasuk before the nuns and a pasuk after the nuns, and it talks about another calamity that came right after the nuns. So how does that work? It works as follows. And it's all through the comment of Rashi that we're able to see this. When the Torah starts off this set of 10 psukim by saying the people traveled away from Har Sinai, and Chazal want us to understand it means they wanted to travel away from Hashem. They wanted to depart from following after the Sinai experience, after the closeness to Hashem that came from Har Sinai. They wanted to travel away from that. That is the same idea as what we see later on, that the people wanted meat, because as the Zera Shimshon has gone to great lengths to explain, their desire for meat was a desire for the Yetzer Hara. Their desire for meat was a desire to pull away, God forbid, from Hashem. And therefore, the Gemara wants us to see that first pasuk, which comes before the nuns, as really connected down. It's almost like we're supposed to take it, bring it down later, and put it in and connect it with the complaints about the meat and the Erev Rav, starting it all off with their complaints about the meat. That should be together. So that's why the Gemara actually asked about what was the first calamity, and it talks about the misananim, the pasuk about complaining, which occurs right after the two psukim in the brackets. And so Zera Shimshon says, wait a minute, that we should really perk up when we see that, because that looks very much like the second calamity. It happens after the nuns. So the Zera Shimshon says, no, the Gemara treats that in a way as the first calamity, because the thing that looks like the first calamity, the pasuk that comes before the two nuns, that they traveled away from the mountain of Hashem and they wanted to depart from following closely after Hashem, that pasuk connects to the thing that is later on. It's the last pasuk in the 10, in the set of 10 psukim, talking about their craving for meat, or the second to last pasuk. It's at the end of those psukim, and we have to see those things as a single unit. The Vayisu Mehar Hashem and the people saying Mi Yachilenu Basar and complaining about meat, those two things go together, because they both represent this tremendously, profoundly unhealthy, from a spiritual point of view, unhealthy desire on the part of the Erev Rav, especially leading the way, and then the people following them, to figure out a way to depart from the Har Sinai experience and begin to have more Yetzer Hara in their lives, which is what the meat represents. The next section, we're going to stop here. The next section in the Zera Shimshon, the next half, I should say, shifts over to talking about the very end of the psukim that we read, when it talked about the mun. Not only did the people complain about not having meat, and not only did they nostalgically remember all of this yummy food that they ate, the melons and the leeks and the garlic and the onions and the cucumbers, they remembered, in the fish that they ate in Mitzrayim, but they also decided to put down, to deride the mun and say, the mun, yeah, sure, we have the mun, that's all we eat all day. It doesn't satisfy our cravings, it doesn't satisfy our desires. And why it is that they turned against the mun, so to speak, and spoke disparagingly about it, comes up in the second half. And the Zera Shimshon also talks about what people can do if they want to eat meat and other delicacies and other foods, and still prevent themselves from becoming coarse and materialistic, and God forbid, turning away from Hashem. So I encourage everyone to look at the second half, and God willing, in the future, we might have an opportunity to swing back and do the second half at some point. Yasher koach for joining in the learning of the Zera Shimshon with us tonight, and we look forward again to learning together in the Zera Shimshon next week.